Hello and welcome to AP Music Theory online this week. If you turn to your notes, we're going to start by asking, what is counterpoint? Counterpoint refers to the combination of several melodies to create one musical whole. And the principles of counterpoint are the basic underpinning of Western tonal music. As you can see from my collection of books here, there's a lot written about counterpoint, and these books actually represent the time period 1725 to, I don't know, sometime in the 80s, the treatises that you see in front of you. There's a ton written about counterpoint, and it sort of underscores how incredibly important the study of counterpoint and also the understanding of counterpoint is to your theoretical studies. So we're focusing in this unit on combining two outer voices. We're going to call them the bass and the soprano. In the next unit, we're going to add inner voices, the tenor and alto parts, if we're thinking in terms of a four-part choir. The principles of counterpoint we're learning focus on the rules common in the common practice era of the 18th and 19th century. So we're talking about 17 and 1800s, the music of Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. They generally follow the principles of counterpoint that we're going to be studying. Now, how will we write counterpoint? There are a number of approaches, as you can see, to learning counterpoint. One very famous approach is this first book, Fuchs's The Study of Counterpoint from Gradus ad Parnassum. This is a book that Mozart used with his students. Haydn studied all the way through it. This was found on Bach's bookshelf after he died. We don't know if he read it, but it was there. It was first published in Latin in 1725. This edition has been translated and edited by Alfred Mann. It is a fantastic book, and I highly encourage you, if you want to do more with composition, to get this book and work through it on your own. Fuchs's approach is to take two independent melodies, and this is without reference necessarily to chords or Roman numerals. What we're going to do is we're going to take a slightly different method in which we're going to acknowledge our chords and Roman numerals using Dr. Monahan's two-part harmonic species counterpoint, which he has used at the Eastman School of Music. This allows us to both study the rules of counterpoint and to review and solidify our understanding of harmonic progression at the same time. Coming back to our notes, why do we study counterpoint like this? So breaking the counterpoint into specific skills is a bit like learning mathematics. If you imagine at the age of 5, you enter kindergarten and you're given a long division problem on day 1, this is going to be problematic. However, if we start introducing children at a young age to the concept that 1 + 1 = 2, eventually they understand addition, and we take things away, they understand subtraction. We begin to teach them their multiplication tables, and then by the time we come to long division, we've actually studied all the species or the parts of mathematics that are necessary to understand that long division problem. Now, when we study counterpoint, we're going to be a little bit like musical kindergartners, and we're going to step back from our knowledge of the symphony and the sonata and all of those things that we love to perform, and we say, okay, what's the most simple way of looking at this? And that's what all these books have in common. They're just trying to break it down so that we can understand it easily. You've already started this process because we've studied the formulation of cadences in two voices. And we're going to build on that foundation today by asking the question, what comes before the cadence and how do we write to the cadence? To begin this process, we're going to start by talking about the kind of motion that we see between two voices. So motion in music can refer to a single melody, meaning music moving up and down. Good melodies have a variety of motion. They create memorable patterns and expressions. A single repeated note is not necessarily a melody because it doesn't go anywhere. A melody moves from one note to the next. When we talk about counterpoint, we're talking about the motion in regards to the relationship between two or more voices as they both move from note to note. And these four motions that we're about to talk about describe the relationship that any two voices might have with one another. On your handout, you have, under point 2, types of motion, a summary of the 4 different kinds of motion that we have in counterpoint. So here we see contrary motion. The voices are moving in opposite directions. Parallel motion. Voices move in the same direction at the same interval. So here we have an example of parallel thirds. Similar motion. Voices are moving in the same direction, but they create different intervals. In this example, we're moving from a fifth into a sixth. Both voices are moving up. And then finally we have oblique motion. One voice is holding while the other voice moves. Here I have an example of species counterpoint. We're going to analyze the motion at the points indicated. So at point A, you can see that the bass voice is moving up by third and the soprano voice is moving down by fourth. These voices are moving in contrary motion to one another, opposite directions. At example B, you can notice that the intervals analyzed are both thirds and both voices are moving up by a step. This is parallel motion. In example C, we move from a third into a sixth, but both voices are moving down. So this is what we refer to as similar motion. Finally, towards the cadence, we have an example of oblique motion. You can see that the bass is remaining on G2 and the upper voice is moving from E to D. So in this exercise we can see all 4 motions, contrary, parallel, similar, and oblique, in action. To summarize, oblique motion, one voice moves and the other voice remains stationary. Contrary motion, the voices move in opposite directions. Similar motion, the voices move in the same direction by different distances. And parallel motion, voices move in the same direction by the same distance. Now we also have motion restrictions, and this is at the bottom of page 3. One reason that we want to be mindful of the kind of motion between the voices is that some motion is not allowed with certain intervals. We are going to stick to 3 rules throughout our counterpoint studies. The first is the upper voice never moves in parallel motion to the bass using perfect fifths or octaves. The second is avoid parallel fifths even when one of the fifths is diminished. And the third rule is the upper voice may not approach a perfect fifth or octave by leap or skip. This is a good way to use similar motion into a perfect interval. Notice that the upper voice steps while the lower voice skips. And here is the best way to approach a perfect interval, by contrary motion. Alright, so now we're going to get into how are we actually going to write for species harmonic counterpoint. We have a bass line, as you can see, in the bass clef, and the Roman numerals are provided for you. Sometimes I might leave the notes off the staff so that you have to figure out which notes you're going to use. For example, we're in C major here, no sharps or flats. It begins and ends on C. We can see the capital 1 is a good clue that we're in a major key. And so I may just leave the progression 1, 1, 6, 4, 5, 6, etc. underneath the staff, and then if you know the key, you can come up with the bass line yourself. But here we have the bass line, and this is how each of our exercises are going to begin, with a bass line that already has determined the chord progression, You'll also notice that at the end of this chord progression, we have 5-1, and that should be an authentic cadence. And here you have the option. You can make it an imperfect authentic cadence by ending on scale degree 3 or 5, and you can make it a perfect authentic cadence by ending on scale degree 1. So that option is yours. That's one of the decisions you get to make. Now, if we take a look at the Roman numerals on that particular example, you'll notice that there are very few. We have 1, 4, 5, and that's it. Just 1, 4, and 5. So it's helpful when you're first starting out to take a moment, analyze the chords that you're actually going to have to use. In this example, 1, C, E, G, 4, F, A, C, 5, G, B, D. There's not even a 5-7 chord here. The next thing we want to think about is the rhythm of first species. This is super simple. We're going to have one melody note for every bass note. The rhythm of the soprano and the rhythm of the bass remains the same, and the example that we saw on page 2 is in first species. We'll move on to note selection. Because you're given the chords for each bass note, you choose a melody from those chord tones. And here I have an example where you can see all of the chord tones. So here we have a 1 chord. Here's a 1 chord. A 1 chord is C, E, G, and you sort of kind of put in gray all the possible notes as you go through the progression. You'll realize right away that you don't want to do this forever, but at the very beginning we're going to do that so that you can visualize, okay, I have all of these options. It's good to know you have many options. It's also good to know that when you have a C chord, C, E, G, you should not be writing an F in your melody. Once you have the outline basically of where you can go from chord to chord, you can then trace your way through those notes and find an acceptable melody. So here we have 3 examples, and yes, they're going to sound very similar because they're based on the same chord progression, but these are all viable answers. You'll notice that these melodies do not skip about a lot, but they also don't just stay on one note. So there's a bit of a contour here. You can see each melody kind of has a bit of its own range, maybe a low melody or a high melody, a melody that kind of cuts through the middle, melodies that go in a downward direction or maybe go down and then come back up. This is page 5 of your handout, so you want to study those and watch that as I play those. So number 5, it might seem overly simple to say trace a melody through the available chord tones without breaking the rules. So I have some specific guidelines for melody writing. The first guideline is to be very serious about the parallel restrictions that you see on page 2. In other words, don't break the rules. The obvious rules, of course, being avoid parallel fifths and octaves, don't move from a diminished fifth into a perfect fifth, and the third rule, the upper voice may not approach a perfect fifth or octave by leap or skip. So those are hard and fast rules we're going to abide by throughout our study of counterpoint. The second point here, don't cross the voices. Now this should be obvious from this particular kind of example, but just as principle, the melody never ever dips below the bass line. The next objective is to make the melodies singable. Try singing your finished product. This is where you get to practice what musicians are often referred to as good taste. Good melodies follow this simple rule that I've picked up from a composer friend. Move by step as much as possible, and leaps are expressive. If you keep in mind that leaps always express some sort of emotion, then you're not going to leap all over the place all the time just to avoid the appearance of being emotionally unstable. Your music should be emotionally relatively stable, and then when you want some drama, use a leap. So follow this mantra for effective, memorable, singable melodies. So for fun, here is an example by Dr. Monahan which ignores this ideal completely. Another objective of good music writing is to avoid the slow trill. So think about this. If you've ever sung alto, you'll know what I mean by a slow trill. Often in a tonal progression, there is a path through the notes which barely moves. This is a filler voice. It's not a good melody. So there's another example by Dr. Monahan which shows a melody that noodles between 3 notes. Finally, be mindful of the contour of the melody. Think about the overall shape. Will it rise and fall? Will it dip in the middle? Is it one great ascent or descent? You might plan ahead. Look through the progressions, see how you want to end the progression, choose your starting note based on where you're headed. Maybe you want to see if the melody will rise for you, sort of at a peak in the middle, and then come back down. Towards the end, maybe the entire melody should be going up or going down. You kind of get to choose that part. Then let's talk for a minute about vertical intervals. So you're allowed to use any interval between the upper and lower voice in this style of counterpoint, and the restriction is based on chord tones and not type of interval. Notice though that a counterpoint fraught with perfect intervals really lacks luster. In your writing, prefer the imperfect and dissonant intervals for a melody that provides good harmony with the bass. Finally, a few specifics that we haven't covered already. On page 7, it talks about chords with asterisks. The asterisk marks dissonant chords, and we're going to learn more about them later, but for now, follow the rule: move out of chords with asterisks by step or common tone. Do not leap out of a chord marked with an asterisk. A common tone is simply a note that remains the same from one chord to another. For example, between the C chord and the G chord, the G would be a common tone. Another rule: don't double the leading tone. Don't ever, ever, ever double scale degree 7. It's against the rules. Scale degree 7 wants to go to scale degree 1, and if you double the leading tone, both voices will want to go to scale degree 1. Also, leading tones go up, so scale degree 7 wants to go up to 1. And remember that when it's part of a 5 or a 7 chord, you're going to move to the tonic note in the melody when the following chord is tonic or submediant. Okay, now we're going to try this out. In the very first example on page 8, we have a progression in D major, and I've spelled out these chords for you. The 1 chord is D, F sharp A, the 2 chord is E, G, B, and the 5/7 chord is A, C sharp, E, G. The first thing we're going to do is write out all the possibilities over each bass note. We're going to trace a melody through them, landing on a cadence formula. So here we're going to write, we see this is a D chord, so we write, okay, we've got D, F sharp, A, D, F sharp, A. Here is a 5/7 chord. This 5/7 chord is in third inversion, 4/2. We just write out our 5/7 chord. I might say, okay, well, it can also include these notes. It can go as low and high as you wish. Moving on to our 1 chord, and you get the idea from here. Okay, by doing this, as I begin my studies in counterpoint when it refers to chords, I'm actually creating a situation in which I should make very few, if any, mistakes. And that partly is because I've already limited my vocabulary. You can see in each measure, I only have the notes that I'm allowed to use. Now I've decided that I want to have a perfect authentic cadence at the end. And you know what that means. I have to use the D in the soprano here at the end. And I'll probably want to approach that from the C sharp in the measure before. So for now I'm just going to mark, I'm going to go from D, I'm going to have a C sharp before it. Now as I look through this progression, I notice that the bass line rises and falls and rises and falls and then rises again at the end. So I have this contour in the bass line. Now in counterpoint, contrary motion is usually your friend, so I like the idea of always striving for contrary motion, but we'll see what we can do. Here I'm going to start maybe right on the tonic note, which will create an octave. And then move in contrary motion to the C sharp. Now notice I'm on C sharp, that's scale degree 7. Oh, before I go on, this is what you want to do. I have an octave here, and I have a 4th here. Don't skip that step, because you might get to the end of your exercise, and as you rewrite it and analyze it, find that you've inadvertently written parallel perfect intervals, and you really want to avoid that. So don't, I suppose this is measure twice and cut once sort of philosophy. Okay, from the leading tone, scale degree 7, I'm headed into a 1 chord. I have 0 options here. The rules state that over a 5 chord, when it's headed back into a 1 chord, if 7 is in the soprano, I have to return to scale degree 1. Notice that already I might be in danger. I might be in danger of beginning a tune that is a slow trill. So I also want to be mindful of that. D, C sharp, D is a perfectly acceptable beginning, but I should not keep waffling back and forth between those 2 pitches as I go. Here, scale degree 7 is in the bass. Remember the rule about scale degree 7 in the bass. Scale degree 7 must never, ever, ever be doubled. So, I cannot go to C sharp in the upper voice. Let's see. The bass voice is moving down. I am not allowed to move down into the C sharp, but I could move up by step into the E, and this gives me a little bit of variety in my motion. I have contrary motion between the bass and the soprano. I'm following the rules. My melody is not terribly exciting, but it's not just wiggling back and forth between 2 notes. Oh, a pause. What's the interval here? A 6th. And here we have a 3rd. Since I'm already kind of going up, and I know that my cadence is going to end with C sharp D, I think, well, you know, here might be a wonderful place to do parallel thirds. I'm moving from E into the F sharp. Alright, so at this point I have 1 measure left to fill in, and you can see the contour of my melody starting with the D, going down to the C sharp, up to the D, up to the E, up to the F sharp. It's a really short melody, so I think this counts as kind of like a downward swoop and a rise. Now as I come to the cadence, I know that I'm going to get to the cadence by this little hook at the end, C sharp D. And I think it would make sense maybe to step down to the E. That would create a sixth here with the 2-6 chord. The E is also important to this chord because it's the root of the chord, so it'll probably give the best sound as well. Now, I'm not doing this as I go right now, but you can also sit at the piano and play this and sort of figure it out. My only caution is that as you play it, make sure that you're sticking with the chord tones. So let's mark this end here. We have the F sharp will step down to the E, and that will skip down to the C sharp, and then we end rising to the D. I'll fill in these intervals as well. So here we have a sixth with the bass, the G to the E. Here we have a third, A to C sharp, and then we are ending on an octave. And if you notice, as I have completed this part of the assignment, 8, 4, 6, 3, 3, 6, 3, 8, there are very few perfect intervals. And even this 4 is actually the augmented 4 with the C sharp and G resolving outward. It's a tritone there. So you see very few perfect intervals. You see a preference toward the sixths and thirds as they're allowed in each chord. And now I'm just going to write it out to show you what it will look like as a completed assignment. Now as I check my work, going from measure to measure and realizing which kind of motion I used, you'll notice that overwhelmingly I managed to use contrary motion. So that's the safest kind of motion to use, the voices moving in the opposite directions from one another. When I get to parallel motion, I need to make sure that that's a third or a sixth. So here's similar motion. This would be a place to be cautious, especially if I were approaching a perfect interval. Since this is an imperfect interval, a sixth, it's okay whether I had stepped or leapt down to the sixth. But here it's nice and smooth. F sharp to E, similar motion. Contrary motion as I approach the cadence. Similar motion here, both voices are moving up, but you'll notice that I've resolved 7 properly to 1. You'll also notice that the scale degree 7 and 1, they're a step away from each other, so this is the one way that we can use similar motion with perfect intervals. The next example, we're in the key of E minor. I'm going to complete this one and put it on fast forward for you so you can see the entire process. The homework is just a review of what we did today, answer the questions, and then follow exactly the process that we just did for writing the first species counterpoint. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Make sure to email me and let me know that you watched the video. That counts as your attendance for this week. So thank you very much, and I'll see you guys next week.